Hello, Ellen.
Hey Mark, how's it going?
It's doing fine. It's been a while. It's been a
It's
week since we talked.
it's been a while, but I'd like to welcome everyone to Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs.
Yeah, been a little bit. We had a guest host on last week. Ilarna is always fun to talk to, but it is also always great to when you and I get a chance to chat.
Yeah, I miss it. I definitely missed it. I appreciate Alerna stepping in again. So good job.
So I was thinking a little bit about what we could do for this week, and I noticed that Voice Talks is coming up pretty much when this episode airs.
Okay.
And one of the topics that they're going to be talking about are kind of best practices. And, when you've got design, how do you turn that into something? How do you put it all together? So it's going to be things like, best practices in marketing and design and development. And I thought, you know, I'm kind of curious, what are some of the things that you make sure you do when we go develop stuff? I mean, because I could think of tons
Mhm.
and tons of design best practices that we follow and marketing best practices and graphical best practices. But when we're developing for voice, what are the most important things we want to focus on?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think I've got a couple of things that come to mind. So the first one I'll just mention briefly. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but if you're going to be developing in voice, I do a lot of cross-platform stuff. So that means I want to do something that's on Alexa and maybe immediately do something that's also a Google Action, or maybe in the future that could be something that happens. So I'm thinking about cross-platform from the beginning, and
Mm-hmm.
that could be, you know, like I say, Alexa or Google or Bixby. It could be adding a chat bot in. So one of the best practices is I use Jovo. It's across, it's it sets me up right. I've been using it for a number of years now. It's very familiar to me. But the reason why is because I keep thinking, in some cases, I definitely need multiple platforms from the beginning, or I could probably likely need a multiple platform solution, in the next year or something
Yeah.
like that. And so I just go ahead and, program just a little plug out there for Jovo, for keep doing the good things that they're doing. But that's one of the best practices that I can see is just keeping in mind that you might be doing something bigger than the project that you're currently on. Not necessarily that you go to a lot of extra work to program stuff in there that could be used in the future. It's just that I'm building on a framework that allows me to do that.
Right. It's the sort of thing you always need to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And I feel like I do similar, but obviously I take a slightly different approach. But my kind of thinking behind it is there's a lot of things that the libraries already take care of for us.
Hmm.
And the more that we can use tools like Jovo or multivocal or voice flow to help us actually do that coding work, that's the
Yes.
less code that we need to write. And that's always a good thing. So one of the things I always think about is, where has this already been done? And
Hmm.
in some ways that's a general coding practice. And I feel like a lot of my best practices for voice are just general best practices for coding
Yeah.
applied to voice. And one of them is, don't reinvent the wheel. Somebody else
Yeah.
has done large chunks of these things. At the very least, go learn your lessons from what we did before. And for me, I like to roll a lot of my best practices into multivocal, which is why I go right to multivocal.
Right.
So,
No,
but definitely
that's
I
important.
can, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this. The same. I think you were going to say something similar. Is that paying attention to the tools and libraries and frameworks that you're using ahead of time. I guess choosing them um, based on, I guess thinking the project ahead, or just I guess reusing them after you've used them before. Tried and true, um, and just keep expanding on that base of code that you're working off of.
Yep, definitely. So once we've got our libraries picked, what's the next thing you always make sure you like to do?
Well, I'll tell you mine, and then we'll find out what your thinking is on
Okay.
it. But this goes along with kind of the first one in the fact of multiple platform stuff. But I always try to make sure all the text to speech or audio files, if you're doing voiceovers or sound effects, is separate from the code. So it's not baked right into the intent handler, but that's separated someplace else, all in one location where you could take that and then send it off to be translated or whatnot. So removing that. And so, and part of that is one of the reasons why I created a speech markdown was that it was cross-platform, and it helped me solve the situation where I wanted to add formatting to my text to speech, but I wanted to not have to worry about all the idiosyncrasies of the different platforms, whether a tag was supported or not, or exactly what the format of that tag was. That's something that I could do with speech markdown.
Yep. No, actually, it's really funny you say that, because that probably would have been one of the first things I would have picked as well. Is definitely the notion of making sure that our responses aren't baked into the code. They're not, some hard-coded string that's in there. And then
Right.
instead we use best practices for internationalization and localization. And that lends very nicely, even if we're not localizing it,
Right.
to storing it separately and not having to bake in these strings. So if we need to add multiple strings or pick one from a number of replies,
Yep.
that's all in a configuration file somewhere. And
Yep.
that's where it should be. So letting tools like Jovo and multivocal pick a valid response.
Right.
That's not something that each intent handler should be calling the random number generator itself and looking through and picking through the list and picking one of them out. Let the libraries do that, and let the libraries do that based on a separate file or storage or something. There's no need we should be coding that ourselves. And in fact, what bothers me a lot about the examples that we see from Google and Alexa when talking about their libraries is that's exactly what they show.
Right.
Is hard coding a single response in. And that feels like it's very much the wrong approach.
Yeah, and in a way I understand, because they're targeting that documentation at, oh, this is somebody that's brand new, and you don't want to overly complicate things, but then there's you either just have to make that leap yourself, or you finally come across something or somebody who says, you know what, a better way to do this would be to,
Right.
And
I think what's frustrating for me, though, is it's not that more difficult.
yeah,
One of the points of multivocal in separating that out was to make it just as simple,
yep,
just as easy to do without adding lots of complication of doing it yourself.
yep. Well, it's funny because we've talked about this multiple times
Yeah.
on this program and on our own, but it's this separating text into its own file quickly leads to, it shouldn't just be the text, it should be the templates. And then you start talking about, oh, that should be in something like a content management system.
Right. And then we go down that road. Yeah.
We just go down that same path again. And yeah, it's a problem that's not 100% solved. There's
No.
definitely room for new ideas and implementations, things that would make it easier for developers.
Yep. I think related to that is one of the practices that I like doing, and that's moving as much of the configuration as I can into some sort of configuration, whether that's JSON that's a file that's loaded in, or whether it's stored in something like Firebase or Firestore or DynamoDB
Right.
or whatever. Just making it so that the configuration itself isn't hard coded in and baked. And then I take that the step and say, well, my responses are configuration. So yeah, I go that step. But it's also other stuff like, if I'm returning a list, how many items do I return on that list by default?
Right.
If I am pausing for something, where do I configure how long that pause takes? If I'm loading in graphics, if I'm loading in other audio, where is that audio stored? Put all of that in configuration rather than baking it in, because it's going to change. It always does.
Right. Well, and I find myself having, 10, 15, 20, maybe more environment variables that get set over time. I even have different situations where I have environment variables for features that I want to turn on or off.
Yeah.
So maybe in this particular environment, I want to turn this feature off, or I want to, test it out. I want to turn it on for a little bit, see what happens, turn it off, be able to feature flag some things.
Yep. One of the things that I even find great is I've made some things dependent on feature detection from the system, and I'll put, what features we need in the configuration file, so that if over time those feature names change or they add new
Oh,
features, or it's more feasible for me to detect other things, I can just change a flag instead of having to hunt down and recompile stuff.
right. Yeah, if you can make changes without having to recompile and redeploy, that definitely saves some
Really saves a lot of time.
time and some heartache. Sometimes you're like, oh, change that database to the wrong database,
Yeah.
whatever, and you realize that something's breaking once you deployed, which is another best practice. Always test in an environment that's parallel to production or is
you know
closely mapping to production. Just the
but
same developer stuff.
but even when it does, you're going to have sudden changes that you need to make in production, or that
Yep.
suddenly find that it broke in production one afternoon because Google and Alexa decided to go and change something without letting you know.
Oh, that would never happen.
Never. One of the other aspects that I always think about as I'm developing is it kind of ties back to a design principle that I keep in mind always, and that's that the intent isn't what you do, it's what the user has done.
Hmm.
And how you deal with that intent can be any sorts of things. So usually on the Alexa side, one intent maps to a handler directly.
Right.
On the Google side, we're a little more flexible. We say that it's other things, the combination of an intent, or one or more intents can trigger a handle name. But either way, I like to remember that that handler can vary what it needs to respond to, what it
Right.
even needs to do in some cases based on other things. So usually I like to write my handler functions so that they're fairly short.
Yeah.
And instead, what they end up doing is calling other functions. And it's hard sometimes for people to remember it's just a function. A handler function is just a function, and it's allowed to call other functions.
Right.
Um, because again, all of the examples that Amazon and Google show these handler functions with huge multiple lines and multiple if statements and blocks and different, handling all sorts of different scenarios, to the point where it starts getting out, no, wait a minute,
Yeah.
what's happening in each of these cases? I like to just make it nice and short so that, if it's this, go handle it with this function. If it's this other function. So I like to remember that, this the again, very, very traditional coding notions of break it up into smaller parts.
Right.
And those smaller parts that you can easily digest them in one chunk.
Yeah, no, that's definitely good advice. I just been thinking about that as well. There's not like a certain lines of code for file, but it does. If it gets up too big, then it starts bothering me. In some cases, I'm like, well, all my handlers for a certain thing are in this file, and I like the fact that they're together. But when it gets to a certain point, then you just like need to break it up and figure out how to.
Yeah. Or if you've got a single handler that is doing too much,
Right.
it may need to, but break it up into logical chunks so that you can more easily narrow on on specific cases.
Right.
And in some ways, that's just a normal programming concept. That's nothing new. It's nothing radical. But when it comes to voice, we don't necessarily think about it because we think about, oh, the intent handler needs to do everything for this intent.
Yeah.
No, we're allowed to break it up. We're programmers. We can do that.
Definitely can. Do you have any best practices when it comes to testing
I'm,
your apps?
I'll be honest, I'm still working on good best practices for testing. I'm just beginning to do automated testing.
Hmm.
And we talked a bit ago about Google now has automated testing libraries
Right.
for their stuff. So I'm just getting into that still. And in some ways it's difficult for me to wrap my head around because what I want to do isn't just test the textual response,
Hmm.
because there could be a dozen different responses in different ways. So I like to think about not just testing what the response is itself, but I set additional values into the session storage and test what those values are.
Okay.
Because that tends to be more what I want to key on and what I want to make sure works. And yeah, I'll test a few of the phrases to make sure the phrases aren't stupid, and work correctly with singulars and plurals. But mostly I want to check and make sure the values get loaded correctly.
Interesting.
How about you?
Um, well, so besides using some sort of a unit test framework, there's the ability, with Bespoken, they have some code where when you're running on Alexa or Google, then you can do some test cases. It's tackling it more at like an intent level. I'm calling this intent, and in some cases that works fine. I've also had situations where I wanted to unit test my handlers, and in some cases I need to mock out some things or set up some conditions. So I've actually set up kind of a flag. So when you're in testing mode, then it actually turns on and it calls a handler that you can set in your unit test,
Hmm.
that gets called right before any of the code that is in a handler runs. And you can then set up some preconditions on different things. And that's helped quite a bit with unit testing. The other thing I found is sometimes when you're testing a big application, maybe it's a game and you've got different parts of your game. I've found where, like, if I want to say, here's a branch and let's call that 1 and 2. I want to be able to test both 1 and 2. So what I do is I go backwards, kind of if you were to envision it as a flow chart, kind of goes backward in the track to the point where the last thing happened before it hits any of the logic where it makes the decision if it branches A or B, right? And actually set up a test case. So I have some special intents that only run when you're in test mode, and then you can say, this is, I want you to execute this, test 1 or
Mhm.
test 2. And so test 1 and 2 might be different based because you might have some different variables, and then but then it hits that point in code where it branches off. And so then you can, imagine at the beginning, then that's going to be fairly easy. You could probably just, start the application and hit that pretty easily. But sometimes you might be like farther along in this big,
Yeah,
thing, and you're
especially
like, okay, at
for
this point in time, let's just test the logic for this situation right here.
right. It's really difficult for something
Yeah.
that's a long, complicated, multi-stage conversation to get back to a single point in the conversation where you've already built up a lot of state.
Right.
So that's a good way to just say, okay, let's just load all of this state and start the conversation here.
Yeah. So then you just like have an intent, like a test case, 73 or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And then um, that helps also if you've got a bigger group or a team, then you can, set them off to saying, this is the ticket that's going to test this thing, and the way to get right to it is this. And so it helps being able to isolate and test different parts of it without having to test the whole thing. Obviously, you've got to test the whole thing too at different points along the way, but It's
Yeah,
good
no, no, no. That
to
makes
check
sense,
little parts off.
especially when you're trying to narrow down a bug and you're like, I know, I want to start at a well-known state
Right.
and then something goes wrong. And
Yeah.
how do I do that? One of the things I also like to do is use, especially when I'm developing, is use something like ngrok,
Yes.
so that I can run my server locally, so that I can see what packets are coming in, what the JSON coming in looks like and what the JSON I'm sending back looks like, and make sure
Mhm.
they look sane. And just, be able to, if something's not working, I can just change my code quickly locally and see it on the local console and debug it quicker that way. So I've got this
Yeah.
much faster turnaround time than trying to deploy things, on Lambda or on Google Cloud Functions or
Right.
whatever.
And then look through your, CloudWatch logs or whatever to try to find
Yeah.
and separate somebody else's testing at the same time that you're testing
Right.
and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, definitely local testing is the way to go.
Yeah.
And ngrok really makes that easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, we got some bonus testing best practices thrown in there at the
Yeah,
end.
well, I think it's important to keep in mind that testing is an important part of development. It's not something we can, we can't just write something and throw it over the wall to QA, as much as I'm sure we like to sometimes.
Yeah.
It's an inherent part of what we need to do as developers. So
yeah, so I take off my developer hat and I put on my tester hat.
And it's challenging sometimes, especially when you've got to stop and thinking, okay, I know how this works. How can I break it? And that's always an interesting, different mentality to start thinking about.
Yeah, it is. It reminds me of that t-shirt where it's either testing or debugging or coding, I don't know, whatever the word is that they choose for the t-shirt is the murder mystery where you're the victim and the murderer and the detective all at the same time.
Yes. So, okay, I think that's, a nice solid set of best practices. The first set of things that we need to think about when we go in and code and develop and then go and test it.
Yeah.
Anything else that jumps out in mind to you about what people need to make sure they think about?
Oh man, sure. There's definitely more, but that's a good start.
I think it's a good start, and I think we welcome people to suggest other things that everyone needs to make sure they think about as they go in and write. Starting a new project or going and editing an existing project. We'd love to hear your feedback about the things that are most important to you that you want to make sure you think about every time you go in and code.
Yeah, and I bet some of them will all think of, oh, wow, that's a really good idea. I need to do that better. Or yeah, we could talk about this for hours. Yeah, so it's good. Definitely share what you're learning, and we would love to have a conversation with you about it.
So send us your feedback. You can find us on Twitter or in the comments below, and we'll talk about it another time on Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Have a great week, Ellen.
You as well, Mark.
Take care.